So thank you very much. I would now invite the panel. Will be moderated by Srikesh Laximides. Srikesh is the editor-in-chief for Lusa, but also important, he worked for Reuters. He spent 3 years in Angola. She has a BA in politics, philosophy, and economics at the University of York, and he spent some 5 years as deputy director of Journal Economic. Srikesh, thank you very much. And as agreed, I would move also to the introduction of the panel. I would now invite Sangudele to the stage to join the panel. Sangu is the CEO of CarePoint, which is formerly Africa Health Holdings. Thank you for joining us. Is as a PhD from the University of Birmingham, and is the author of Making Futures, Young Entrepreneurs in a Dynamic Africa. And he was named a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and the 2022 Eisenhower Fellow, Africa's Young Person of the Year. So, Sangu, thank you so much also for joining us in Carcavelos. And next, I would invite Dr. João Pedro Oliveira Costa, CEO of Banco BPI and a member of the Executive Committee of the Board of Directors. Thank you so much also for joining us. Decades of experience, including in the BPI group, today CaixaBank, more than 30 years of experience and knowledge also joining at the panel. And finally, a warm welcome to Ms. Nelma Pontes Fernandes. She's an entrepreneur and investor with 2 areas of expertise, business and training people, and represents the CPL, the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Language, CPLP, and Association of Human Entrepreneurs in Portugal, has a degree in financial management, leadership and career development for women and business, and she's a former student at the Católica University School of Business and Economics, also here in Portugal. So thank you. Srikesh, I would pass to you. Thank you for the moderation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for the introductions and the warm welcomes. Good afternoon to everybody. Our time is limited. Time is always our enemy, as we know. So I'll keep my introductory notes very short, very swift, just to say thank you to the Conselho de Diáspora for the invitation to moderate this panel, whose subject is, as we've seen already, wide-ranging and complex. We've had an excellent start with the 3 keynote speeches. Thank you, Antonio and Vivian. And from Brussels, our participation in extreme circumstances via video is very interesting. After that start, we have a very interesting panel which has been introduced already. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure being on the stage with you. I will direct some questions individually, but this is an open debate. We have approximately 30 minutes and a little bit less. I'm getting signals from João to keep it shorter. Okay, and we'll also have a little bit of time to open questions to the audience, so make notes and think of interesting questions or more interesting ones than mine, please. Let's start with disruption, which is the theme of this forum. We've talked about a lot of different types of disruption, more recently geopolitical and war disruption, which brings economic and employment issues, which is the subject of this panel. We've talked about climate change, we've talked about COVID and the pandemic, but I'd like to start with one disruption which has been going on for a bit longer, and which several of the keynote speakers mentioned, which is the digital transition and how Europe and Africa deal with this, each by itself and within partnership. I'll start with a question for João Oliveira Costa, because I know your background in banking, both in a group that has presence in Europe and in Africa, in a sector which has been leading digitalization in both continents for quite a while. I'd like your input on how can this alliance between the EU and Africa accelerate digitalization on both sides, and how does that translate, in your view, in your experience, to growth and further employment as well?
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult question, because talking about such a difficult issue that is digitalization, that is a key point now everywhere, but perhaps is more in Africa than it is in Europe, because of the inclusion that it means when you go into that path. I would like to start to say, you talked about disruption, so I'm going to start with something disruptive. Europe needs more from Africa than Africa needs from Europe. Let's be honest. That's the start. That's the start. Because if we don't get on this line, we'll never understand our role on this alliance. Because Africa is the country, is a lot of countries from Africans, is not from Europeans. So first of all, they have a lot of choices of partnerships around the world, and the Europeans sometimes, I know that Antonio told that we were over there a very stable way. I don't see it like that, and European institutions sometimes doesn't support companies and entrepreneurs from Europe to go to Africa, and doesn't understand the reality over there. That's my experience, and I have two very good experiences. It's not my work, it's the work of the Angolans and the Mozambicans, that they build up two great banks in each country, and they are an example to us in many things. Not only the way of work, the way they deal with the clients, but also in all these developments of the digitalization. So I would say that this partnership is in two ways. We need to understand what are the very good practices over there, and there are a lot of good practices, and we also have very good practices. Right now, these two banks are 99% of local people. We started to having Portuguese over there in a certain percentage. It was very small. Now it's almost zero. It's 99%, as I said, and they are ruled by them, and the banks are better than they were in the beginning. So the question is, yes, we can have a partnership, first, second, but we must believe that the knowledge is in both sides, and never having the idea that you are the best one and the others not.
So this idea of balance is extremely important from all the speeches that we've heard and from the conversations that we've had. Next question is for Nelma Pontes Fernandes, with a little bit of focus on the CPLP strategies. Question is, what do stakeholders such as governments and international organizations and business associations really need to do to ensure that a wide range of sectors benefit from this? We know that banking has been in the front of this, but we need to see, my question is, how can the other sectors benefit from this transition, and to ensure that parts of the economy and population are not left behind, so there's no info exclusion, which has happened in some cases?
Ok. Vamos entrar no processo disruptivo, porque eu vou falar em português.
Força.
E vou falar em português porque estou aqui a representar a Confederação de Mulheres Empresárias da CPLP. A CPLP é uma comunidade de 9 países, onde a língua oficial é a portuguesa. Portanto, nós queremos manter isso e fomentamos, para além de vários objetivos que temos, fomentar a língua portuguesa. Em primeiro lugar, agradecer o convite de estar aqui hoje, cumprimentar as senhoras e senhores, os meus colegas do painel, respondendo agora a questão que coloca. Vamos ver isso em várias perspectivas. São duas perguntas numa. A primeira questão, relativamente à transição digital, a comunidade CPLP, desde 2018, que tem uma agenda digital. Até a nível governamental, existe a governação eletrónica, onde é debatida alguns temas do desenvolvimento socioeconómico dos países da comunidade. Quando olhamos para aquilo que é o desenvolvimento tecnológico e digital da Europa versus aquilo que acontece em África ainda existe um longo percurso que temos que acautelar. Aqui na Europa, mais de 60% das empresas são digitalizadas. No universo do continente africano, estamos a falar de usuários de cerca de 11%. Portanto, a discrepância é ainda imensa nesse campo. E tem outro aspecto, quando falamos do que é que não se pode deixar para trás, na minha opinião, é na componente educação de crianças e de jovens. Falou-se aqui em várias potencialidades que a África tem, isso é tudo verdade, mas, na minha opinião, a maior potencialidade que a África tem hoje em dia é o capital humano. E temos que olhar para esse capital humano de estarmos sensibilizados para aquilo que é a sua educação. Temos o exemplo da Índia, por exemplo, que há uma década decidiu investir naquilo que é a cultura digital. E nós temos que entender essa parceria Europa e África também nessa vertente. Enquanto a população africana, os jovens, as crianças, não tiverem acesso à educação, podemos falar de uma forma simples, que é o acesso à internet ou um tablet nas escolas.
Como vimos na pandemia.
Como vimos, por exemplo, na pandemia, algumas escolas utilizaram essa via. Esse processo de desenvolvimento não vai acontecer em África. E não vai acontecer por uma razão muito simples, porque a parceria que existe hoje entre Europa e África, ou mesmo outros continentes, é olharmos para a África com todas essas potencialidades que se falam, mas na perspectiva de ir buscar recursos, ir buscar aquilo que a África tem de melhor e transformar nas tecnologias europeias e vender noutros mercados. E aquilo que se vai buscar, a própria relação, não é uma relação, digamos, justa. É uma relação que não é de todo benéfico para a África. Como estava, exatamente, completamente desequilibrada, como estava há pouco a referir o João Pedro a nível da banca, que, graças a Deus, tem já 99% de capital nacional. Portanto, eu acho que o olhar, nós, no continente africano, só para ter ideia, no continente africano existem apenas 2 países industrializados, África do Sul e Egito. O que quer dizer que o potencial está
tremendo, sim.
Todo por fazer.
Não, obrigado, excelente resposta. Estou a gostar muito deste painel, bastante disruptivo, mas vou passar para o inglês. Turning back to English for the benefit of the next panel speaker. This is a question which I will pass to Sangu and then also to Antonio, because you touched on it in one of your slides. China is a big investor in multiple aspects of African economies, and not least technology, where we've seen the 5G terrain being disputed by the US and China, like in other parts, like in Europe as well. We've had these arguments here. How can Europe compete with this Chinese approach and also the American incursions in this battleground? How can European technology interests benefit Africa and help Africa develop, and also by virtue helping in reciprocal terms?
Yeah. It's an important thing you mentioned, but I think there's a lot of things to unpack there, right? So the first is, if we look at the lay of the land today as we speak, for every dollar of venture capital flows that comes into the continent, 80 cents is from non-African firms, right? And that's mostly currently dominated by North America, mostly Silicon Valley, and then you kind of have Europe as the dominant forces when it comes to venture capital. And the venture capital market has grown significantly. It was from 10 plus years ago when it was about $10 million across the continent. Last year was $5 billion. Q1 of this year was $2 billion. But the issue when it comes to is a question really of not just who's getting funded, how inclusive is that funded? Yeah. So if you actually look at the capital coming from the EU, of the $5 billion I mentioned, less than 1% went to women, right? Less than 1% went to women. And if you start unpacking, if you look at places like East Africa, funds that are coming from the EU, development funds that are backing African-focused vehicles, you look at the portfolios, you can do this. Go and look at the portfolios and run an analysis. There was one I just did in East Africa where over 80% of all their portfolio companies from an Africa fund was not run by Africans, right? So, and there's so many examples of this. If you talk to anybody in the ecosystem in East Africa. So when it comes to before we even talk about the prospects for what we can do in the future, there's analyzing the present today.
Why is this happening? Is it about governance? Is it unequal access to these funds?
Yeah, well, the problem is who gets funded, right?
How, yeah.
And so if you look at the portfolio managers of where funding is coming from, they don't look like me and they sure don't look like her. And so if women are excluded from the table where decision making is made in terms of capital allocation, in a region where we have the highest rate of female entrepreneurship in the world, the highest rate, we have more women starting businesses across Africa than any other region in the world.
But the capital doesn't get to them.
Yet how do you have less than 1% of the capital going to them, right? It's a problem. The other issue when we talk about EU-Africa alliance, we need to have some honest conversations. We have a fragmentation of Africa. You have Anglophone Africa, you have Francophone Africa, you have Lusophone Africa, and then you have North Africa, which conveniently gets excluded when we talk about Africa. So we need to start having some honest conversations about how we want to have this interaction. Because if we talk about EU and Africa as if we have this, common interaction ground, it is erroneous. And so we need to start unpacking some of those silos. Because for me as an entrepreneur, when I invest across the continent and I move across the continent, you realize that from an Anglophone perspective, if I start in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, okay, that's a lot easier. When you start to move into Francophone, it's a completely different world. And it's a world that's now dominated mostly by France. If you suddenly want to go into Lusophone Africa, completely different world. And so we need to have some honest conversations about that, especially in the context of the Continental Africa Free Trade Agreement, where if we're actually talking about EU-Africa alliance, what are we talking about? Because France has a separate idea
of course,
for how they want a France-Africa alliance, different from a now UK post-Brexit, which is looking at UK-Africa alliance. Portugal also looks at it from a different perspective, where there's a Lusophone lens, and then looking to grow that. And then, of course, North Africa just gets complicated because it gets thrown into the MENA region. There's the Middle East. We a lot of times forget it's even part of Africa until we have the Africa Cup of Nations and Egypt wins another
Or we need more
round.
gas from them. We need more gas from them, like that.
Exactly. So I think that the honest truth is there's some frank conversations we need to have, right, about moving away from the rhetoric of just smiling and saying EU-Africa and having real conversations about what do we actually mean, where are the silos being created, where are the mafias being set up to prevent the sort of cooperation we need to have, and how do we actually ensure that the EU and the Africa we're talking about on an operational level for entrepreneurs and investors, we're actually seeing that in practice, and it's not just grammar we're coming to speak at these conferences and we'll come back 2 years and speak the same grammar.
Thank you, Sangu. Just following up to finish this disruption element, there's several more. Antonio, you spoke about true partnership, which leads on from what Sangu was saying. How much is this technological drive that's already happening for the last decades and which is going to accelerate in the next couple of decades? How important is this aspect of technology to try and create this true partnership between the various parts of the EU and the various parts of Africa? What is this opportunity? If you just give us an insight into what this opportunity is for both sides.
Just to start, I agree with what was just said, in the sense that there are still divides, that in a way come from, a few European gentlemen sitting in Berlin and drawing lines in Africa, and we still have some long-term consequences of that. And that's why I think but it's not the Commission that has the power to do that. The Council of Europe should also try to foster and help Africans to come together more and have a one-to-one relationship at that level, and then develop the other relationships below. But, don't treat Africa as France's Africa, English Africa, because we are way past colonial power and colonial times, At this table, I'm the oldest, and I was a child when colonialism ended in Africa. So let's treat Europe versus Africa, and then let Europeans help and let the European companies and let the African companies really together create projects and finance it together. And so I think that's the key. The big competitive advantage of Europe over the US and China is that we have much stronger bonds for the bad and for the good with Africa. We understand, we stay much more comfortably in Africa with African partners doing business than the others do. We have a much more proximity in terms of values than the others do, both Americans and Chinese. I'm not just talking about, but to do that, we have to really have joint projects. And joint projects is not a project where all the board is European and everybody else is African. It's something that is really melted and mingled between ones and the others. And I think that, for example, the case of solar power, I brought that because I think it's an area where we can create a value chain from the materials needed to produce the panels and all the technology up to the final product, and do that production entirely in Africa. Because it's going to be good for Africa, that's value that is being created in Africa, and it's good for the Europeans because they are leading technology, but they can do it better, more efficiently in Africa than if they take the materials from Africa and do it in Poland. So it's mutually beneficial. And that's finding these partnerships and the opportunities that we should, I think that's the only advantage for Europe, that is the weakest of the big ones, to really gain from Africa and have Africa gaining from being a partner of Europe.
So the question I have for you, Prof, is how, if I look at it historically, right, we've historically spoken, we went into the era where we said trade, not aid, and we pushed into greater economic cooperation between both regions. But if we're being frank, that economic cooperation has never been on equal terms. It has mostly been focused on how does Africa's growing middle class and the growth of the economy become new markets for Europe, and you've seen that, where if you look at if you actually look at the trade and you dig into the trade and you unpack it over the last 50 years, you start to basically see that from the African side, we're exporting mostly commodities, unfinished, unprocessed, and then we send it out, it gets processed in Europe, and we get it back, where we pay a lot more for it. A lot of the attention around building our local capacity around employment, if we're being frank, only came up because of this migrant crisis, right? And so how do we actually, I want us to really dig into say, how do we pragmatically create a win-win relationship that will benefit the continent in ways that are not just to prevent migrants from crossing the sea, but will actually result in a win-win across the board and can present something stronger than, the Chinese alternative or the American alternative, right? Because I think that while the history has been there for a long period of time, the reality is it doesn't mean anything. Practically speaking, what can we do? What's the framework to create a win-win for both sides?
It's like you're asking for a magic recipe there.
I think one very important point is the willingness to have true joint, I don't see the Chinese, to be very blunt, to have a true JV in equal condition with Africans in Africa, to produce in Africa, with the Chinese mingled in the African places, not staying all in their barracks and all away from the rest, and really have African suppliers, try to incentivize the suppliers, incentivize the local clients. It's a bigger turf with a lot of human capital potential, where European companies can grow doing what they do in Europe with African partners. And I think that's something that the Americans don't do because, they have a hard time understanding Europeans. They have even harder time understanding the Africans. And the Chinese don't even want to understand anybody. They want to do business with all of you. So with Portugal, they've done a lot of business. They want to do a lot of business in Africa. But do they really want to have joint things with the Africans? They don't. they don't want to have with Europeans or it's a different mindset. I'm not being normative. I'm not saying it's worse, it's best. What I think is the proximity and the ability of some, especially in the younger generations, to have true partnerships with Africans. In Africa, I'll give an example. There's a student from this school. He was a student of mine, of many other of my colleagues. A few years ago, he started a company to foster trade and projects between Europe, Africa, and then from Africa is now also in South and North America. And the first, where he really started the company was in Lagos, Nigeria, with Nigerian partners. And then they opened an office here in Lisbon, it's 5,000 miles. And then they opened an office in South America, and now they also have offices in Florida. And then he also has in Johannesburg, and the partners are from Nigeria, from South Africa, from Brazil, from Portugal, from the US. That's the way we have to do, equally, and I think Europeans, like the Africans, are more flexible for doing these things together.
And also, I think what's been mentioned here before and during the day is the advantage of Europe that it understands the need for economic and business sustainability in Africa, which is something the other continents aren't doing that well, as we've seen in the past. Let's go to the near past, and that subject we could obviously are not over yet, but we can start analyzing it. COVID-19 pandemic was a global-sized disruption, quick, sudden, and which is still lasting, and whose impacts we're still analyzing. Sangu, I know you've dealt with health issues in the last few years. I know this is an open question, but what did this pandemic expose or highlight about the healthcare systems of both continents, and what economic opportunities and needs does it bring to this alliance? Well, what is the next step?
Look, I think that COVID for the whole world, probably with the exception, since World War II, COVID was probably the one event that everyone all over the world experienced at the same time. With the only exception is climate change. It's the only other phenomena that I think affects every single person in the world at the same time. It exposed the fragility of our health systems and infrastructure on the continent. And I think while we were largely spared, mostly due to lots of factors, including the youthful, the fact that our demographics are mostly young people, and we generally tend to have a healthier population with respect to NCDs and so on and so forth. But for those who actually had to deal with the system was overwhelmed. The health infrastructure was overwhelmed. And if you look at high-level numbers, we're currently about 15% of global population, yet we're responsible for 26% of global disease burden, and we only have 3% of global healthcare workers. In Europe also, when Europe went through the pandemic, it was clear that the healthcare infrastructure here was also overwhelmed. And if you project out for the next 10, 20, 30 years, there's also going to be a shortage of medical personnel here in Europe.
There is in Portugal, for example.
Yeah,
already,
it's a major problem. And yet at the same time, we already only have 3% of global healthcare workers. And this is us at 1.3 billion. We're going to be 2.5 billion by 2050. 1 in 4 people globally will be African. So this creates, and if you look at where our birth rate is currently, in Europe, it's below replacement level. It's about 1.4, right? 1.7 in the US, 1.1 in China. In Africa, it's 5.9. So what does this mean when we get to a point in 2050 where this is going to actually be a massive disaster, where our healthcare system simply will be incapable at present rates? If we don't do something drastic, our healthcare systems will be incapable, and we're already seeing the massive brain drain going to Europe. So something needs to happen. There has to be a change in how we approach this. We need to have greater cooperation to stop the brain drain, or to figure out ways in which we can invest to scale up that training where we can become an export market. But we also need to produce enough to solve our own local healthcare needs, and we have the capacity to do more, right? Because otherwise it's immoral.
So that's investment in medical universities, essentially.
But we're going to, look, if you take the old way of doing things, hundreds of millions of people will die while we wait. Think of how long it takes to train a neurosurgeon, for example. And literally, we just have 20 plus years for us to get to 2.5 billion. So we don't have time to do business as usual. It means that we have to rethink and reimagine how we're looking at delivery of care. How can we use some of the emerging technologies out there, artificial intelligence and machine learning, to take some lower trained, skilled people? How can we take some of the experts here, for example, retired people, we can leverage teleconsultations to be able to do work. We're going to have to rethink the system, right? Because the old way of doing things is simply not going to work. But I think there's an opportunity if we approach this together to say, look, we'll have the largest mass of young people and a young labor force. There's going to be a shortage of doctors and nurses for us. There's a shortage of doctors and nurses here. Is there a way in which we can invest together in the solution to scale up and to do things differently, both on the technology side and the production of medical personnel side, where we can simultaneously scale up to solve for our local market while creating enough to also export to solve the chronic shortages that are going to happen in Europe?
With such a complete answer, I'm going to skip right to our next disruption, given also our level of limited time, which right at the first keynote speech from Brussels highlighted what the war in Ukraine, or in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as we should put it, in my opinion, has brought in terms of disruption globally and with heavy impact on Africa and Europe, given that the war is in Europe as well, which is a food crisis, an energy crisis, and a financial crisis. Given the time that we have, I'd just like to hear from each one of you what you think has been the impact and what is going to come, because it seems that this is a situation which is not going to be resolved so quickly, and where the biggest impacts have been, and where, finally, if you can, where there's some opportunities where Europe and Africa can help each other in handling these crises. Start with Elma.
Eu acho que essa situação, para já, inesperada, não é? Acho que estarmos a falar de um conflito militar numa altura destas é aquilo que ninguém esperava. É, para além de uma tristeza, um choque. Portanto, eu acredito que seja uma oportunidade de parceria, efetivamente, entre a Europa e a África. Mas uma parceria em que a África tem que se movimentar em bloco, porque a geopolítica está toda ela a reorganizar-se, não é? Com este conflito militar. E a África tem que dar essa resposta nas parcerias, talvez seja o momento da oportunidade, que tenha efetivamente chegado pelos recursos imensos que tem, mas há que existir um cuidado de perceber que os países, como o Sango dizia, essas diferentes direções que temos em África, em separado não se vai conseguir chegar àquilo que é necessário. Portanto, a África neste momento tem que perceber quais é que são as mais-valias dentro dos setores de atividade e juntarem-se em bloco. Isso sim vai-se conseguir dar uma resposta válida para se conseguir emergir em algo que possa ser uma solução económica. Até porque, mesmo para outras perspectivas, hoje em dia, quando não pensarmos numa economia global que assenta no desenvolvimento dos países desfavorecidos, vamos estar a dar espaço naquilo que é a migração, a criminalidade, que vai estar exposto ao mundo inteiro. Portanto, há que ter atenção a esse ponto.
Sr. Pedro, tem ouvido CEOs de bancos nos últimos dias, porque é a altura de resultados.
Speak in Portuguese?
Diga?
I will speak in Portuguese?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll ask the question, whichever is comfortable.
But I will try to speak in English because of Sangu.
I'll ask the question.
Mind.
Sorry,
Okay.
I got confused in the languages a minute. We've been hearing CEOs of banks talk in the last few days because it's the results season, and it's interesting, at least from the few that I've seen, the headlines, is that a lot of them are showing more worry about the energy crisis than anything else. You know, profits, losses, it's a season of high profits, but compared to last year. But a lot of them are talking about the energy crisis as being a risk which could extend to the financial system. And so my question to you on this front is, how is that affecting Europe? How will it affect Africa? And where does that impact the relationship?
Okay, about listening all the panel, I believe that Sangu is the person who knows better about anything else. She has the most experience. To be honest, hearing him, he has the experience, he has the clarity, and he says the things right away. And I like very much this, and I believe that we must listen to someone who really knows. I remember when I went to a factory once in my other life, and I visit a client, and he works in a factory, and in the top of this factory, he was a very humble man, and he says like this, I accept ideas or new ideas for someone who did it better. And I believe Sangu did it better, so that's why I'm just a Portuguese guy that lives in Portugal and has some experiences in Africa, but so it's very difficult for me for trying to say something better than Sangu, to be completely honest. And I believe truly that we here in Europe, we must think first what is going to be our role. And in the times of need that we are in times of need. We are in the beginning of times of need. And listen to this. And so we need each other. And of course, the question of energy, Africa is going to have a role, a very important role. So we must think in the future how we can manage these differences that Sangu mentioned. And when he talked about the Francophones, the Lusos, I say it? Lusophony, yes, Lusophonia, and the Englishman, I truly, is completely correct. Sometimes when I listen to him in this matter, I listen to myself in Portugal when I talk to Germans or French or other guys in some institutions in Central of Europe. They don't really understand us. And they manage, for example, the last crisis like an experience in Portugal and in Greece, and we accept it. That is not acceptable. That is not acceptable. So the question for the future of energy and everything that we're going to need, my belief is that we're going to face such a huge challenge that so many small questions that we are discussing here are going to be so small. All these questions about digitalization, for example, are going to be so small. Again, water, listen, water. We're going to have a problem with water. The second one, of course, it is energy, but energy you can produce with more cost or less cost, but water you cannot produce. So water is going to be another thing very important, and health. And health for me begins in the social beginning of everything. It's the question of poverty, extreme poverty, and of course, if you left your country to go such a poverty, and then you buy a very expensive medicines, it doesn't make sense. So perhaps it's much cheaper than you fight poverty than go and give them medicines or other things. So for me, the question is, you must change this negative cycle in the beginning for Africa, and that's where we can get a partnership. And what we can give, what can we give to Africa? Of course, technology and financial resources. And Africa can give us people, as you mentioned, and energy. And we need this energy.
Relating to poverty and energy, poverty specifically, we're looking at food as well. You know, we've been looking at the last week negotiations to unblock the delivery of cereals from Ukraine to Africa, which highlights the fact, again, like health, that a continent with so many resources is still highly dependent on imports for many aspects of nutrition. How crucial is this going to be? I mean, I don't think any of us disagree that there's a very bleak view for the next few months with a difficult winter coming. how much harm is this going to cause in terms of nutrition in Africa and resulting poverty?
It's going to create a significant problem. I think if you talk to folks at the World Food Programme, they're already raising the alarm bells, right, over crises and many humanitarian crises that are going to be created. But for me, I think that some problems are opportunities. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. COVID was one opportunity we saw where we saw that it shifted the adoption curve for digital, right? And it suddenly created a huge impetus for digital. This crisis, Africa currently has 60% of the world's available arable land. It makes no sense that the continent does not feed itself, let alone is not a net exporter. You know, I had a friend from Israel who came to visit me in Ghana. And he comes, he spends a few days with me, and he says, Sangu, I figured you guys out. I said, what do you mean? He said, God has blessed you people too much. That's why. You go, you spit on your soil, something grows. He said, that's why you people are not, you are just walking. He said, come to Israel. We don't even have water. We have to try and do desalinization. We are fighting everybody on our borders. You need to grow stuff. We have to put, he said, everything we have to do, you have to sweat for it. But you guys, your soil, you have everything. You just throw anything on the ground, it grows. And so there's a huge opportunity. And I think that this crisis needs to make us change and to say that how do we make sure that a continent that's so richly endowed, how do we make sure it's self-sufficient? And how do we ensure that some of the crisis that's happening in Europe from food today, how do we turn some of those supply chains, move them towards Africa? Because what does that do? It diversifies your supply chain. So it from a national security and a crisis perspective, it reduces concentration risk for Europe. 2, it helps from an economic development perspective, right, which we've already discussed in the past, that we know that I think it was George W. Bush who under his regime, where they came out with that theory of where you have the national security implications of allowing poverty to continue. And so, and we know that, and we've been seeing that in the last few years. So I actually think there's a huge opportunity here for the EU and Africa to take agriculture as a cornerstone to say, how do we diversify supply chains? How do we let Africa now be a new producer to help diversify some of these chains? And that ends up creating jobs on the ground. We have 11 million young Africans who join the labor force every year to meet 3 million jobs.
Fantastic.
We have to do something about it.
So it's an urgent challenge.
Yes.
Antonio, before we move to audience, I think Joao's going to let us have some time with the audience. Just a closing remark on this issue, which you touched upon very, very widely in your speech, which is what is going to be the macro consequence ultimately for, I think we're all again in agreement that the recession is coming. How deep can this recession be if this situation isn't resolved, and how will it impact this relationship? Because this is a relationship which most relationships do well in good times. In difficult times, they don't tend to work so well.
Well, it's very easy to describe the phenomenon, but it's very hard to guess how long it will take, because ultimately it depends on when will Russia think that they have had enough. We know that it was said this week by Shoigu that he wants to restore the borders of the old Soviet Union. I don't think that cannot happen, because some of the borders include countries like Lithuania, like Latvia, or like Estonia. They are independent countries that are on another side, cannot be conquered, because the other part of NATO has the obligation to defend them. But having said that, I hope there's a settlement for the war, of course. I don't think it can go for a long time. Let's suppose that it goes till the winter or early spring or something like that, which is bad enough. What we have now is we're going to have scarcity in terms of food. It's going to be worse in some countries than others. I think I'm much more afraid, even though I'm not a local expert, but I'm much more afraid of what can happen in North Africa than of what can happen in, for example, in the equator, because in the equator people will get food anyway. It will fall. It falls off the trees. So, but you know, in urban centers is different. But North Africa is a real danger with this. And other parts of the world, more so than Africa, for the reasons we know and were just exposed by Sango. The problem is we're going to have inflation. We can tame inflation with the means that we know if the war stops within the next few months, I'd say 8 months, 9 months, or 6 months, but it doesn't go on forever. Because if it goes on forever, you know, it's a war economy, so, you know, peacetime economic projections are not really relevant because it all depends on what's behind it. But what we think is, what I think is, you know, in what most people consider the central scenario, we're going to have, you know, important inflation this year. Some countries that have problems in both South America and Asia and Africa that have balance of trade payments will suffer. Okay, and so the world institutions will have to take care of those cases that may get out of control. And it's not an African problem. It's a problem of some countries in Africa, but many countries in other continents as well. But I would expect that inflation will start to tame in 2023, which is what most independent experts expect.
Yeah, consensus. Thank you, Antonio.
And like I said, just to finish taking his words and also Telma's words and João Pedro's, I think that could be here an opportunity because in my speech I was talking about the entire value chain of digital and green energy. He was talking about agriculture and food industry and health industry. So, you know, there's plenty of areas to focus, and I think it's easy to find a consensus on 3 or 4 areas that are of the utmost importance for Africa and for everybody.
Great, thank you.